Hey, this is Jeffrey Towson from Peking University, and my number one tip for achieving your China dream is big dream plus daily habits. Have a big vision, have a big goal, something that's worth spending years of your life fighting for, translate it into stuff you do every single day. And then everything in between there is pretty flexible. If you want to run a marathon, run every morning. If you want to be a writer, speaker, which I do, have a big vision, write every day. But that's sort of my advice, big dream, daily habits.
Coming in today, Jeff.
No, thank you. My pleasure.
Pleasure to meet you. So I wanted to start with people who may not have heard of you, which if they're on LinkedIn is probably not very many anymore, or the people who haven't read your book or sort of seen your work before. If you could do maybe a quick self-introduction, who you are, what it is that you do.
Right. I mean, I'm a business person. That's my training. That's my background. I do a lot of analysis of studying companies, studying industries, and then that leads into various endeavors like making investments. Or I used to do management consulting like McKinsey type work. So again, it's the same process, which is study, analyze, put it together, and figure things out. So that's kind of where I sit. And within that, one of the things I've been doing, I really do two things in life. I do deals, which is mostly healthcare, but I rarely ever talk about that. And then I have sort of a professor hat, a writer, a speaker. You know, these things all used to be separate, right? Maybe you're an author, maybe you're you're giving talks, maybe you're doing teaching, writing books, whatever. Those things all seem to have come together. And the phrase I like to use is thought leader. That's where I'm trying to go. And then, you know, if you have a certain expertise in things, which is my area is digital China and Chinese consumers, that then plays out in various formats, whether it's writing articles, whether it's giving talks, whether it's teaching classes, which I do at Peking University and some other places. But that's all kind of become one thing, which is interesting. So that's kind of my two hats, is sort of deal guy and, you know, sort of digital China expert, you know, probably. But it's all sort of thinking and writing at the end of the day.
So when did you come to China? Why did you come here in the first place? And then why have you decided to stay?
I mean, I came a little different. I was a New Yorker, living in Manhattan, doing financial services, sort of MBA, MD type. There's a sea of people like me. And then I ended up working for a Saudi prince out of Saudi Arabia, almost on a whim. I didn't think about it. This is back 2001 or so it was a long time ago. And this was before emerging markets became a thing. Like everyone thought I was weird. Like, why are you leaving Manhattan and financial services to go out into the emerging markets? Nobody talked about emerging markets, very few people back then. And so I did that for many years, and I got comfortable working in places like Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Jordan and Lebanon, and going between there and the developed world, which is a lot of this business. And then from there, I sort of ended up going into China more and more, and it was pretty clear that China was going to be, in terms of the developing economy story, and its collision with the West, that was, you know, the mother of all opportunities. So I came to China about 2007, 2008 for the first time, and it was pretty much the same playbook. It was just a much bigger version of what I'd been doing in the Middle East and other places. And then, you know, China kept getting bigger and bigger, and I've always kept one foot in China, Asia, and one foot in the US, and I go back and forth. And that's been my world for about a decade. And it's gone from a peripheral subject that people didn't really care about, to a subject that business people were aware of, to a subject that has become politically relevant and now culturally relevant. So, I mean, China, Asia, and I wrap these things together, has moved from the periphery of Western life. You know, it's something Congress people talk about. It's something that's in the Washington Post, which is, you know, mostly politics, every week, if not every day. That wasn't the case a decade ago. So it's interesting that it's moved so centrally. Yeah, but I've been playing around this world for a long time now.
Well, before you arrived, like you said, you know, we don't hear that much about China from the West, and now we're hearing more and more and more. Right. And it's coming through a certain lens often. And so I'm wondering, what were some of the assumptions that you had about China or the way businesses run here that didn't turn out to be quite right, or how has your understanding changed having spent so much time here?
I mean, I wouldn't characterize it as a China thing. I'd characterize it as a developing economy thing. I was already sort of very comfortable in operating in a different way, because I'd been traipsing around North Africa and the Middle East and doing deals and studies and various projects. So you do learn to operate differently. You know, contract doesn't mean that much. There's games people play, but there's games people play in the US too. It's just different. So I was pretty seasoned by the time I got here. So it wasn't much of a shock to me. I think that's maybe a little different than people that come maybe directly from the US or Europe or the UK and come to China or somewhere else, you know, Thailand, India, places like, and they get a little bit of a shock that things do work a bit differently. I didn't find it much of a shock at all. I was pretty streetwise by the time I got here. Maybe that's a little different.
Mm. And so the book you wrote, the 1 Hour China book,
right,
and then subsequent different sort of focuses on that, is written, you know, in a very simple way for people to understand sort of the bigger trends that are happening in China. And I'm wondering, what have you heard to be some of the bigger sort of preconceptions or misconceptions that people have about China that are not actually true here on the ground?
Right, this is a book by Jonathan Wetzel and myself. Jonathan is a senior partner in McKinsey. I mean, he was, I think, more or less one of the key people that opened McKinsey's office here in Shanghai in 1994. So we sort of knew each other, and we wrote this little book to, you know, we actually had a lot of people involved. There must have been 20 or 30 people involved developing the content, but then you can read the thing in an hour or so. So it was sort of a little targeted book, a speed read for smart but busy people who are trying to take the first step. And that was a nice little play. Actually, it's done really well for a book. I don't know how long it's been on the bestseller list, 3 or 4 years now. So that was kind of, you know, something we wrote which did well. In terms of preconceptions, the way that book came about was there were so many people that were just looking at China for the first time. Business people in Peru, congressmen and women, policymakers. You know, it just became part of people's lives to some degree, and they didn't know where to start because it looks really complicated. And it is kind of complicated. So we tried to paint a simple picture. Look, it's not that complicated. But, you know, so that was kind of a first step. Here's a way to think about all of this. But yeah, it's hard to dabble in China. It is a big country. I mean, you can spend 10 years studying the financial services market. You can spend 10 years studying the healthcare market here. It's a big, complicated country. And we would say the same thing about Europe or the US. You can spend your whole career studying banking in Europe just to get good at it, or technology in the United States, or I mean, you know, you have to kind of get away from the idea of understanding China, and you just have to think about, like, you know, what's my world? Oh, you study automotive. Okay, study automotive. But it's big and complicated, and that's fine. But, you know, trying to get your brain around all of China, you know, good luck. It's big, and it's a big place, and it's getting more complicated every year. A lot of people, a lot of companies. So there's nothing wrong with that. But maybe the days of understanding China are over.
Yeah.
It's too complicated now. Pick a subject, dig into it. You know, in a couple of years you'll get your brain around it. But understanding all of this, a lot of it I have no clue about. So I know my world.
How important would you say to understanding what you've been able to develop so far is time actually here on the ground in China, and how much of it is stuff that you've studied and analyzed and sort of read reports about?
It depends on your sector. Like, I think there's certain industries, I'm talking business, there's certain industries you can't really understand without being on the ground for some period of time. Consumer behavior. If you're just reading reports about Chinese consumer behavior and why they buy this soda but not that one sitting in Ohio, good luck. It's helpful to have lived on the ground and walked and, you know, had your WeChat and your phone and get used to how things work. And you could say the same thing about the US. How do you understand how Americans shop if you haven't just walked around and lived it? So I think certain consumer behavior you probably have to be on the ground. Things like semiconductors, no. I mean, if you're good at semiconductors and you understand how they work in the US, you can probably get up to speed here. It's pretty much the same. Building airplanes, you know, if you're good at building airplanes, yeah, you don't have to live here. So, I mean, it does depend a little bit. Real estate is pretty local, consumer behavior is pretty local. A lot of the more sort of serious technology, science, engineering, no, that's a skill set. If you're good at it, you can probably be good at it anywhere. So I think it kind of depends a little bit. Culture and media is pretty local. Consumers are local. Real estate is local. But yeah, it depends a little bit.
So over the last decade and more that you've been in China, what would you say are some of the challenges that you've come into personally, and how did you find a way of overcoming them?
In terms of business or life, or what are we talking about?
Yeah, I think that sort of comes into your mind, where it could be a bit of both.
I mean, business challenges is a whole subject. I think maybe that's a little bit too specific for what we're talking about. Living, getting used to being a permanent expat in many ways, that's interesting. It's a lot of people struggle with this question of, do you go home? And you stay here for a certain number of years, and often the cost of being abroad raises. It gets harder to come, depending on what you're doing in life. The cost of going back to where you were can grow with time. Because while you're doing this, you know, maybe people in your field are doing, you know, they're building their careers back home, and you come back and you don't know as many people, you don't have maybe the same track record. I mean, there's an opportunity cost in certain aspects of life of being an expat, that by doing this you're not doing other things. And then if you decide later, I'm going to go back, that can be difficult. It depends what career you're doing. Some people move around quite easily. Others, you realize that, you know, the cost of living here is going up versus if you were to ever go back. So that's kind of interesting. I think about that a lot. I have sort of structured my career against that, where I'm half here and I'm half home. But yeah, there's nobody plans to be a permanent expat, right? It just kind of happens. You think it's going to be for a while, you enjoy it, then maybe the years go by and you realize the cost of going, you don't know as many people back home as you used to. I mean, there's a funny process by which people become permanent expats or permanent sort of nomads. And I'm definitely in that category. I'm a global nomad. You know, I'm teaching here in Shanghai this week, and I'm doing some meetings, and then I'll be back in Thailand, where I keep my home, and I'll be there for the month. And I consider that as much as my home as the US at this point. But that's a weird process by which you sort of become foreign or an expat or global. A lot of people are like that. It's interesting to watch it play out. And it has a certain impact on your family versus your career. So, I mean, you move around a lot, you know.
Yeah,
it's an interesting group of people who live like this.
It's interesting to me also because you're the first person who's brought it up in this way, you know. Thinking about, you know, how much time do I actually want to be spending here, right? And as I continue forward, is it going to continue to be as much or more or less? And often the trajectory tends to be people come in and they try to build something here and then they try to get out. But it's like you can never really get out, right? If you want to continue whatever it is that you've built here to continue to work.
Right.
It's like, how much time do you want to continue spending here, and how do you make that feasible?
It's hard to dabble in China. I mean, because if you're building anything, it's a pretty tough market. What I've done is I focus, I this question sort of, how do you live as an expat? How do you live in this way? I break it up into life and business. Now, the business question I thought was easy to answer because I've set up my own business, whether it's the media stuff and the writing or the deal stuff, to be cross-border by definition. So it's fine. But are you going to raise kids in China? Are you going to raise kids in Thailand? The life question is maybe a little bit more complicated, and I have by and large dodged that question. So that's something I think about a little bit. But yeah, it's weird to be an expat.
And so you came here sort of with an idea of what you might do, and I'm wondering, how did you come to sort of start teaching and decide that that's what you're going to do at Beijing University, and And like, how did you find your space here? How did you find your niche here? And how did you determine that that was the right place to be?
Right. I mean, there's the business, and then there's sort of the media stuff and the writing and the teaching. I think on this one, it was a harder challenge. After I sort of left working out of the Middle East and I came here, I knew I wanted to write. I didn't quite know why. I mean, it took me a long time to like figure out why I wanted to do it, but I knew I wanted to. I wanted to like have an opinion, and I wanted to, get something out in the world. I don't quite know where that comes from, but it was definitely there. And the way I thought about it at the time was, I want to write a book. I want to write a book. But if you had asked me, why do you want to write a book? I don't know if I'd have a good answer then. I do now. Like I wanted to be a thinker and a writer and an influencer. Those are all funny words. I don't really like those words, but they're directionally correct. I wanted to be a thought leader and an influencer. I really don't like those terms, but it does capture the idea. It feels a little arrogant to me. To build a body of thinking and to have it out in the world and to have it mean something to people. So one expression of that was to write a book. Writing a book is generally a bad business. Generally, it's a bad idea in general. It's very hard to succeed. So I became a professor. Same idea, to teach, same process. Over time, I found better ways of doing that. And so now it's articles and it's videos and it's speaking and it's teaching. But it started out as, I want to write a book and I want to teach. Now it turns out I think both of those methods are problematic. But the idea was there from the beginning. But I couldn't enunciate it for a long time. I meet a lot of people who are like this, who said they come to me and maybe they call me and say, I want to write a book. I say, why do you want to write a book? And they can't explain it either. And then
there's this urge inside that sort of drives.
Yeah, you have something in your head. You want to have a voice in the world, and that's not an insignificant thing. I think it's a very important thing to have a say in things and to have opinions and to have it not maybe matter, but to have some degree of thinking and influence on the world. It's a big deal. Is that more important than making money? Maybe. Warren Buffett talks about this. I mean, I think about him a lot. When you ask him to describe himself, he describes himself as a teacher. He says his legacy is as a teacher more than anything else. And he writes and speaks and talks to the press all the time. So that stuff is not insignificant, but I don't quite have the right language for it yet. So I was there in 9 years ago, I was thinking that in some form and trying a lot of stuff, and most of it failed. Book writing, little teaching, giving talks, blog. I failed at almost all of it, and I finally sort of figured out how to make that work. But yeah, I didn't quite know what I was doing for a long time, which is interesting. And why do we do the things we do? I don't know. Sometimes we just do it and then we figure out the thinking behind it later.
In hindsight.
In hindsight, you figure it out, but at the time, I don't know, we just do it.
In terms of success here and making the market here, how important would you say are speaking Chinese, being able to understand the language, and understanding the culture, like whatever is meant by Chinese culture?
I am not awesome at Mandarin. I'm functional, and it is probably a problem. I'm gonna have to sneak away for a couple months and get myself to fluency in the near future. Speaking Mandarin matters. Now, if you're a surgeon and you're coming here to do stuff, it doesn't matter. If you're great at technology, it doesn't matter. But in a lot of businesses, it really does. And outside of business, things really, the days of having translator are probably coming to an end. And you can make an analogy. How successful would you be in the United States if you don't speak English? Okay, if you're brilliant at something, maybe. But generally speaking, that would seem a weird idea. It's becoming weird here. So I pretty much tell everyone, look, start learning. Just start. It doesn't take that long. Just put in the hours over time, and a couple years later you wake up and you'll have it. But those days are probably coming to an end. I'm okay, but I'm not great. I actually read quite well, which is weird. I can read very well, but I don't speak terribly well. And I tend to operate in business in English just because I do a lot of speaking and I express myself better. The way it tends to be working when I'm doing stuff now is you will deal with someone who is Chinese and they will prefer to speak Chinese because they express themselves better. But they understand if I speak English. And I will speak English because I express myself better, but I understand his or her Chinese. So I have a lot of these conversations where that person speaks Chinese. We each speak the language we're most comfortable in, but everyone understands each other. That seems to happen more and more. Yeah, I think it's becoming a requirement. And I set people up with Chinese teachers all the time. So I'm sorry, what was the other part of it?
Yeah, and then the other piece is around the culture. Like how important is it to understand what Chinese culture is like, and how would you even frame that as like you were talking about earlier, like China's so big, right? And there's, how can people get a grasp of that?
I mean, it depends what you're doing. I don't feel like I have any particular knowledge into the culture here. I don't. I mean, I learned Chinese by reading annual reports. Like, that's what I studied. Like, they would give me these things about, let's learn about Chinese culture. Here's about qi pao and food. And I was like, I don't care about this. We're just going to read annual reports because that's all I care about. So I'm not terribly aware of that stuff. And I was meeting with some people over at Disney yesterday, and that's kind of a consumer-facing industry. It's digital China plus consumer China. That's my strike zone. But when it moves out of beer and things like that into fashion or entertainment, I do find it harder to understand because I can't predict what TV shows will be successful here. I can't do it. It's too much of a cultural question. I'm too outside of that. But I can figure out why Johnny Walker is, doing well or not. Yeah, I don't feel like I really am terribly good at it. And I don't feel like I'm terribly good at American culture either, though. So it's not, it's just not my thing. I'm a business guy. So yeah, it probably matters depending what you're doing. Media, it's incredibly important. Fashion, it matters. Music, entertainment. A lot of things, a lot of industries, it's a big deal. My industries doesn't tend to be a big deal for why people are buying things online versus on their phones. These e-commerce and digital China questions don't tend to be cultural very much. So.
You talked about digital and e-commerce there, which seems to be absolutely exploding here in China at the moment. And I'm wondering, how do you keep up to speed with everything that's going on? Because there's this new app that comes out, this new platform. This platform's growing. How do you understand what's going on in the market when there's so much new stuff all the time?
Right. I mean, this is really fascinating stuff. I mean, rural e-commerce is taking off. Social e-commerce is taking off. I mean, it's just action all over the place. The way I approach it is, I have a body of thinking I've developed over, a decade of frameworks for how to think about various industries and how they compete. So I have a sort of a deep vertical of thinking, and then I apply that to what's happening in the news. So when these things pop up, I already have a deep sort of vertical of thinking that I draw on. It's no different than being sort of a corporate lawyer with 15 years of training and then looking at what's happening in the M&A news this week and drawing on that to speak about that. I find the people that are really useful to listen to operate that way. They have some depth of expertise in an area, and then they apply that to stuff that happens very quickly. Most people I know, that's how they operate. But journalists typically don't do that. Journalists are typically focused mostly on understanding what's happening this week, and that strikes me as very difficult. They're always running around, flying around, trying to figure out what's actually happening and getting the data. I don't really do that. I just apply my own expertise to the situation. That's sort of, you're going to have in my world, you're going to have expertise in one of two areas. You're going to either have expertise in getting info. Journalists are very good at that. Market researchers like Sean, who you talked about, is very good at that. Or you're going to have expertise in analysis. That's where I live. And then I apply that to various things. But it's, I've been working on my frameworks and how I think about competitive dynamics and digital competition. I've been working on this for a decade. And I think about it every day. So that's kind of the way I approach all of this. But yeah, there's an enormous amount happening.
There was an interesting concept that you brought up in one of your recent videos. Forgive me if I'm saying this wrong. Super platforms, was it?
Yeah.
That sort of idea. And I kind of heard of bits and pieces of these kind of ideas before, but the way that you framed it kind of gave me a very good understanding of, whoa, there's something coming, and it's really going to change the way that we interact with everything. And I'd love to sort of, if you could share a little bit about what do you mean by super platforms and how are they going to be relevant over the next few years?
Right, like if you think about when you buy stuff in the real world, you walk down the street, you need healthcare, where do you go? Well, you go into one building. Then you want to buy a coffee, you go into another building. It's not the same building. You might go into a shopping mall, you might go into a little retail store, you might go to a hospital. We don't all go to one mega superstore that has everything we need in life. And the reason we don't do that is because the cost structures of the physical world, putting up walls and things, make it inefficient. Okay, but when you move online, if you look at a purely online business, it's very easy to collapse various services into one web page. I can go on the web page, I can surf for stuff to buy while I'm watching a video in the corner and while I'm chatting with someone. You wouldn't do that in the real world, but in the online world, the cost structures we see here don't exist here. So it's easy to collapse services together into one thing. So that's why we may go to Amazon or Alibaba to buy a huge amount of stuff in a way we wouldn't go to a real store to do. We may get all our entertainment from one vertical. I mean, the economics of online are different, but the economics of online are starting to invade the real world. And that's what's kind of happening, is we're seeing a merger of suddenly I'm buying dinner on my phone by hunting through restaurants, and then 20 minutes later someone pedals up and delivers it. So the online world is merging into the offline world. Alibaba is combining these things, supermarkets, department stores. A lot of that is changing the economics of the physical world, to some degree, in some cases not. So what we're starting to see is this idea of super platforms, that in certain aspects of life, like mobility, there's a collapsing of various services. Suddenly I don't take the bus and then I go buy a token for the metro, and then I get off and I buy a bicycle to ride for 15 minutes. That's all collapsing into one app on the phone that lets me access everything I need. Metro, taxi, bike share, ride hail, plane ticket, everything related to mobility is collapsing into one app on our phone that also entails all the physical assets. And that's kind of what we're seeing, is these mixture of online and physical assets collapsing into one super app. And that's what a company like Meituan is doing. That's what a company like Didi is doing. That's why they're getting into ride sharing, they're getting into cars. All of these things are collapsing into one mobility super app. Every time I need to go from here to there in life, I press this button on my phone, and it takes care of everything I need. Every time I want to buy something like a product, I might go to something like an Alibaba New Retail, one button for all things. I buy dinner, it's delivered to my house, a bottle of wine comes with it, maybe I pick up the movie at the same time, which is streamed into my house. That's one button. Healthcare could be one button, financial services could be one button. So we're seeing these sort of groupings. Now, it won't go all the way, but you can see a lot of activity of people preparing for that. Alibaba, when they do Singles Day, their big theme for Singles Day, they had a couple big themes this last year, 11/11. One of them was entertainment meets commerce. It's not that different to buy a bottle of shampoo and buy a movie on your phone. What's the difference? Mobility's happening. So you're seeing that in a lot of places, which is interesting. And it'll be interesting to see how far it goes. McKinsey wrote an article a year or so ago saying that the future is going to be like 20 major ecosystems that are like this, and that will be everything we need in life. I don't really buy that, but I think directionally it's probably correct. So it's fun to watch. You can see it in the news every week.
So for people looking to sort of get into the tech industry or whatever it might be, I think a few years ago it would have been like create your own app about something or something like that, right?
Could do that.
And these days, we're hearing more about like WeChat mini programs and stuff like that. So I'm wondering, for people who are thinking about entering into the market in that space, It's like, well, how do I can't compete with those super platforms, right? Like it's just too big unless I'm, have a huge amount of investment or whatever, if I can hit the market in the right way. But how do you see the potential opportunities there for people when these ecosystems are being built?
I mean, that's a bit of a startup question, which is not totally my area. That's a venture capital type question, right? Certain businesses, by the nature of the economics, are winner take all. WeChat is winner take all. There's no alternative to it. It's one thing. Facebook is kind of winner take all. There's not 5 Facebooks in the world. There's one Facebook. Other businesses like e-commerce, which is Alibaba, there's more than one winner. There's winners all the time. There's new little clever e-commerce plays emerging in China all the time. Pinduoduo, Xiaohongshu, JD's doing stuff all over the place, cross-border luxury, Farfetch. I mean, we're seeing stuff all over the place. That's an industry where we're going to have a lot of big winners. Maybe it's not 100 winners, but it ain't one. And that sort of follows from the economics and other things of the business. So you're seeing a lot of creativity. These things are changing very quick. Now, what is maybe different about China is you do have 3 companies that really do dominate the internet space, and we don't see that. I don't really know anywhere else in the world where we see that, where you've got the Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu is much, much smaller now. It used to be similar. We don't see that anywhere else in the world. Now, Amazon is big in the US, but we don't see we don't see these sort of digital conglomerates like we do in China. That is a very interesting phenomenon, and people do think about that. Can you live between the elephants? That's a good question, and I think about that one a lot. Do you want to partner up with Alibaba? If they want to buy you, do you say yes? Then you're part of the ecosystem of Alibaba, or do you say no, and then you have to fight them? You do want to fight Alibaba. So that's an interesting question that some companies do face, and most of them say yes. Let's merge up. 50%-ish of the venture capital investment of China is coming from those 3 companies. We don't see anything like that in the US or Europe or anywhere else. So yeah, there's some interesting dynamics going on here with these large platforms. It's a question.